So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I know that this was a short notice on what our presentation would be this week. I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. We are recording this, and before I go any further, I would like to give our interpreter for the evening, Adriana Ferro, an opportunity to introduce herself.
Buenas noches a todos. Estamos reuniendo entonces para este programa de parte de una organización que ustedes tienen y necesitamos entonces que una vez ya estamos nosotros aquí listos, por favor, en donde ustedes tienen un globito en su computador, en la parte de abajo, les indica los dos canales, inglés y español. Necesito, por favor, que pasen el audio a la parte de español. Así ustedes me escuchan en español, mientras que yo escucho a la gente en el grupo general en inglés. Yo les voy a hablar a ustedes directamente. So I just told them to please switch into the globe, whatever they see, the English and Spanish section, and I'll be talking to them, and you will not be hearing me.
Fantastic. And if you need anything, we will hear you switch over into English.
Or I can even, if the case may be, sometimes I can even, write a little note in here in the chat. And if there's somebody paying attention to the chat.
Yes.
That'll be great. Okay, good. So I'm going to switch now. Okay.
All right. Did everybody hear that? Yes. Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much, Adriana. We are going to introduce our presenters for the evening. We have Megan Pinchback from Dyslexia on Demand, and I believe have not seen her.
Oh, I was like, I'm here.
Was Mary Stowe from William and Mary joining us also? I believe, but I don't see her in. I am going to spotlight you, Megan, and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. I'm going to turn the program over to you now.
All right, great. Can I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes, you should have permission to do so.
Okay. All right, is everybody able to see that? I hope thumbs up. Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the presentation today called Essential Structured Literacy, Unlocking Structured Literacy for Every Child. So we're going to be touching on everything from the science of reading through how the brain learns to read and what we need to know as parents and educators regarding the pertinent questions to ask about literacy instruction for our kids. So whereas I'm going to be speaking on national changes after my part, if she is here, Mary Stowe is going to take over and she is going to speak about how all this is reflected in Virginia specific related policy.
And Mary just arrived.
Okay, great. So I always say, most importantly, thanks for showing up tonight to listen to and taking the time to listen to this presentation. Whether your child's neurotypical or neurodiverse, every parent needs to understand what's happening in the educational system today and the areas that need to change so that we can best serve the needs of all of our kids. So a little bit about me and what makes me qualified to present to you guys tonight. So although my main professional focus is in dyslexia, I have a vast background in special education. I've taught all the special education classrooms from self-contained units all the way through inclusion support. And eventually I landed as a certified academic language therapist. So the acronym is CALT, and it basically means that I'm the top level credentialed dyslexia professional kind of out there. So a CALT is well-versed in literacy instruction because we are structured literacy experts. I always say we were structured literacy before structured literacy was cool. So currently I am the owner of Dyslexia on Demand, where we work to reach children all over the nation and international with top tier dyslexia therapy. But I speak to parents across the nation daily. So it really provides me a unique perspective to the dyslexia climate state to state. What I do know is that there's a huge gap between parents' trust and understanding of the system and what the schools can and will do for their children. So before we start, we have to have some background understanding of what has historically been happening in the schools that led us to where we are today. And when we understand how they're providing the kids with instruction and intervention, it really helps to understand a little bit more about why it has historically been unsuccessful. So we're going to start with some stats, and then we're going to move to the why behind the stats. And guys, if I ever turn my camera off, it's because I might notice there's a low connectivity. I live out in the middle of the country, so just heads up on that. All right, so let's start with the stats related to the current plight of literacy instruction in the US for all of our kids. So this may or may not be common knowledge, but the most recent Nation's report card showed a staggering 68% of fourth graders read below the proficiency level. And this is really important because it's a watershed year where data shows a correlation to high school graduation rates. And ultimately, you can see what this translates to as adults. With 63% of students graduating below reading proficiency, and 43% of our US population is considered functionally illiterate, which can be pretty hard to wrap your head around. But until a major shift occurs in the style of literacy instruction we do, these poor rates are really just going to continue. So all of these poor instructional methods impact our society, with 54% of adults between the ages of 16 and 74 reading below a 6th grade level. And if you remember from that slide before, 43% of that 54% are considered functionally illiterate. Again, using Nation's report card data, as you look at this, you can see our numbers really have not changed over the last 30 years. This graph is showing the average US score on the NAEP approved state assessments. That's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And you can see that this is not a COVID bubble or anything we can attribute to COVID. COVID years were actually quite in line with the previous 30 years. Now, this is for all kids, those with and without dyslexia or an SLD. This slide showing similar data, but presented by total children meeting the 4th grade proficiency standard. In the last 30 years, the highest level of students ranking at or above 4th grade proficiency level is 37% for our nation. So I ask, when this many kids are struggling, who is going to notice those kids who have learning challenges, such as dyslexia? So now we're going to focus specifically on kids with learning challenges, since that's who we're here talking about today. Remember, these are our kids who are supposed to already be receiving individualized intervention daily on their campus. Research shows that kids with an SLD can achieve commensurate with their peers if given appropriate intervention and support, but more than 95% of 4th through 8th grade students with an SLD are not proficient in reading. And then if you're SLD and Black or Hispanic, you're that much worse off. And the Nation's report card isn't the only thing that's showing us we have a problem. The parents are really feeling it too. I literally took this screenshot last week. As a whole, 51% feel that public education's on the wrong path, and 32% are unsure. And that's really a huge amount when we really think about it. So what have we done as a nation to address this enormous issue? Well, back in 2000, the National Reading Panel released a lot of data surrounding the 5 key components at the core of effective reading instruction, where they laid out the importance of structured literacy, which we'll talk about in a second. But since this critical body of work was released, we really have had little to no change. President Bush started to address these and this data with No Child Left Behind back in 2001. But that all happened around the time of September 11th. And so it took a big backseat to that and never continued. We're, of course, all familiar with the reauthorization of IDEA. And then what I say, one of the most valuable things of late was the creation of the Soul to Story podcast by Emily Hanford through American Public Media. She really lifted the veil to the general public about the current methods of reading instruction that the schools are using. And it's really, really powerful. And I recommend you check it out if you're not familiar with it. But since it came out in 2022, it really triggered a whole lot of media about what's going on in our schools. So where's the breakdown? 2/3 of our nation's children cannot be special education. So here's my synopsis. Structured literacy instruction, which I not ever really been included in university level classes. Balanced literacy approach is all that's really been instructed, if anything. And that's starting fact at the core of it, where it really all started, is that I'm a certified elementary education teacher, and I was never really taught how to teach a child to read, not one class. And dyslexia was never once mentioned or any kind of learning challenge. Of course, I'm ancient, but when I speak with recent grads with elementary education degrees, it's really the same story. Literacy instruction is not on-the-job training. It's an intricate process that takes skill and study. On-the-job training is actually this balanced literacy thing, because it comes from the delivery of scripted big box curriculum. And on that same note, a large majority of our US schools literacy curriculum historically has not been based in the science of reading or research. Instead, it's been based on philosophy of balanced literacy. And parents really trust that the schools are going to lead when our kids are having reading troubles. But if you understand that the schools aren't trained on how to teach children to reading or how to intervene, it's a really false assumption on the parents' part. So before I go into instructional methods, I want you to remember this. Balanced literacy equals bad, right? And structured literacy equals good. Balance seems like a happier, more well-rounded term than structured, so people can get confused sometimes. All right, so let's look at the primary approach in our schools for the last 30 plus years. So before balanced literacy, it was this thing called whole language, but that was equally garbage, so we can really lump it all together. Whole language was the idea that when you surrounded children with great literature, reading just kind of happened like osmosis, because they just developed this love of it. So they just immersed themselves in it, and it just kind of happened naturally. So you can kind of see what we're working with. And this approach has really been around since about 1980. So I had to throw this in for fun, and I'm sure you saw all this meme, but it's April now, so it's a little outdated, but the words and the sentiment aren't. It's really important to realize as you listen to me speak about legislation and momentum that's starting to be created related to the science of reading and structured literacy, that we cannot sit on our laurels and believe that the problem is taking care of itself. When I speak to parents across the nation and states where legislative action has already occurred against balanced literacy, enforcement is not happening. So it's really up to parents to continually ask the right question and put pressure on the schools to make sure that they're making student-forward decisions. Change is really hard and scary, and they feel overwhelmed, and it's easier just to keep doing what you've been doing. All right, so I'm going to take you way back to the Ice Ages, once upon a time when many, many people were taught to read, and this was through like decodable readers, Dick and Jane books, that kind of thing. And those people actually learned phonics. Maybe not to the extent of the intensive word structure analysis of proper structured literacy, but that was the primary driver of literacy instruction. So why did we stop all that? Well, back in the 80s, the whole language movement started, and it was based on this idea that reading and writing were concepts that should be seen as wholes and not parts. So the idea was that the more you exposed kids to reading, the more their brains would just pick it up and hence become great readers. So I don't know if any of you guys had that DEAR time in school, that drop everything and read. That was all based on this philosophy. Well, there was always a bunch of skepticism around this. And in the 90s, a compromise was kind of met between the two camps of thought, and balanced literacy was born. So it has a smidge of phonics, but there's a lot more emphasis on whole word guessing. In balanced literacy, they introduced cueing to help that bridge. And more importantly, publishing companies released curriculum, and the names that they had behind this curriculum were big, and the teachers all got behind them or really were enthused. But what we didn't know was that it wasn't based in research. So one of the big problems with both of these movements was that we really didn't need to teach phonics and just expose kids to great children's literature, then prospective teachers never learned how to teach the structure of the English language to their kids when they were in college. So back in 2000, remember that National Reading Panel released what is now known as the basis for the science of reading, but research was no match for the money behind these big box publishing houses, and we're really left with the mess that we have today. And some states were starting to catch on due to their horrible scores, but it really wasn't until Sold a Story came out that most parents really started pushing legislation, and people started to wake up. So notice that I didn't say educators. Remember, change is hard and scary, and a lot of them are not going out reading that research and seeking it on their own. So here are the main points of balanced literacy. Phonics instruction is extremely limited. It doesn't happen nearly long enough or explicitly enough, and this means reading tied through spelling. There's no why or rule-based instruction occurring. There's no sequential logical order. Also, the focus is much more on the meaning of text versus the accuracy of what is read. And of course, we all know that we need both. The 3 cueing method is deeply ingrained into balanced literacy also, but the biggest thing to take away is that it just isn't working. So I mentioned the 3 cueing method, and that is one of the essential backbones of structured literacy, and it's still a primary method that's used in a lot of current instruction. So the cues are to look at the picture, look for cues in the word or around the word, ask yourself if it would make sense. Now recognize those are all context-based strategies, and the last step is to decode as a last result. Now, this is taught in the early formidable years of K through 2, and after that, it's just what kids' brains have adopted, and they just simply apply these bad habits to larger words and text. They tend to be very prone to errors, substitutions, and omissions, and that, obviously impacts ultimately their comprehension. Now, as of 2024, 13 states have banned 3 cueing, but my state, Texas, banned it back in 2022, and they still use it at my school. But it's just so ingrained in the teachers, it's a really hard habit to break. You can pass laws, but no one's really enforcing these laws. They don't have big trucks showing up outside the schools, forcing them to dump all their old curriculum in and haul it away. And even if they do haul that curriculum away, we have some heritage teachers with that's the only way that they have known how to teach a child to read, so they just keep doing it. In fact, a 2019 survey of teachers showed that 75% still use this in their current instruction. So I want to give you an example that we're going to act out of why it's important to understand all the facets of structured literacy and just phonics even. This is really more of a phonics-based example. So this is my daughter, Pepper. She's now in 2nd grade, but at her kinder parent-teacher conference, and I would say, bless that sweet teacher who had to have me there sitting there analyzing her, but she wants Pepper to show off her newly found reading skills. Now, this was in a level B reader, which is very low, as I'm sure you can imagine. And we come to the word mother. Now, I want to, preface this. This should have not ever been in a book at this low of a level because this is not decodable for a kindergartner. But heads up, these non-decodable words are very, very common in these texts because they're expecting 3 cueing to happen. So this teacher prompts Pepper on the 3 cues. Look at the picture, look for the clues in the word or around the word, and ask yourself if it makes sense. And Pepper still can't get it, so we're left to decode. So I know most of you guys are on mute, but to yourselves, I want you to sound out mother like a kindergartner would, and I'll help you out. Ah, t, eh. Now, if we were to blend all that together, it does not make the word mother, right? And that's because mother is not a decodable word for a kindergartner because they're not equipped with that level of systematic phonics instruction yet. So they haven't been taught digraph TH, they haven't been taught R-controlled vowels, and scribal O is really quite an advanced phonetic concept. So of course that's not in there. But that teacher didn't know enough phonics to notice to not tell her to try and sound it out. But this also just shows you why cueing's wrong. And ultimately, these techniques are making our kids feel unsuccessful since it's really a game of 20 questions, and that's not effective. Imagine the perspective of Pepper at level B, and she can't be successful until she memorizes the word. And Mother really has no business being in that level B reader. But ultimately, you know, as I asked in my other son's IEP meeting just a couple of weeks back, when are they going to stop using these leveled literacy books to determine progress? Because it really doesn't mean squat. So this is such a great visual since it helps you to see what our kids are up against in balanced literacy. Balanced literacy is the same fruit salad every time. In structured literacy, in converse, we're going to add fruit in a systematic way and only add the next fruit once we know our bodies can digest that fruit until we finally have a true fruit salad. Leveled text is more of the same, and it just forces memorization. And in fact, it actually is in effect forcing the brain to operate like a dyslexic brain. So here's a piece of balanced literacy, and I'm sure it's something that we all know that, you know, everyone thinks is gospel. And it's when two vowels go a walking, the first one does the talking. Well, the first one actually only does the talking 32% of the time. So that's only 1/3 of the time, and it's just not effective instruction. So now that you know how to recognize it, I want you to look at this list, and you'll probably recognize some of these names because they're so common, such as guided reading, reading recovery, and then that dreaded F&P letter system of leveled literacy instruction. And if you've heard the acronym BAS, that's also related to F&P. So, so what I'm trying to explain to you here is that this is balanced literacy is based in philosophy. It is not based in research, and it has not actually been peer reviewed. So Dr. Matthew Burns of the University of Florida, and if you're not familiar, the University of Florida is a leader in literacy research, found that until he tried to study F&P, the test had never been done. It had never been independently validated to see how closely its results aligned with other reading assessments. The only studies had come internally from Fountas and Pinnell. His research showed that it could only distinguish proficient and struggling readers about half the time. So in essence, you could just flip a coin and it would be about as accurate in terms of the results. And for those kids who needed the most intensive support, it was only identifying them about 31% of the time. But it's still used today in 1 out of every 6 elementary schools. And guess what I got from my child's school a few weeks back? You guessed it, F&P letter-based system growth. And as a professional, I know that this doesn't really mean a hill of beans. So when a child memorizes 10 words, they can read 10 words. And they don't actually feel confident to try to decode words based on their skills since they're so used to reading by memorization. But if you teach them 10 sounds and you give them text that supports that ability, they can read a total of 26,320 words. But we're fighting a system here. Cueing strategies and balanced literacy is really deeply ingrained into the public education system. And we know that skilled word reading is not a detective game. But using context, such as one of the main pieces of balanced literacy, research shows is effective 1 in 4 times. And research shows that when you're memorizing another piece of balanced literacy, the brain makes an error 1 in 5 times, equaling 80% accuracy. So here's kind of a visual of what that could mean to the comprehension of a text. So this brings me to one of the largest issues that we have with the switch over to the right way of teaching literacy. Our teachers don't know how. They likely didn't learn phonics or remember it, and structured literacy is much more in depth than they understand. And some states like Texas now have legislation that have forced current teachers to go to these reading academies that span 11 months to learn the elements of structured literacy. But then they go back to their campuses. or they've often have a balanced literacy curriculum adoption, and they're still the low man on the totem pole, and they're forced to use this stuff. So they're not the ones allowed to make these decisions. So I just kind of want to give you insight as to the reality of what this looks like and how we're making changes, but they're misaligned, and it's just kind of, there's a lot of broken out there. All right, so if balanced literacy is clearly wrong, then what is right? And how does the science of reading fit into this whole mix? So in a nutshell, the science of reading is scientific reading instruction, and it's what structured literacy is based on. It's a body of research that incorporates insights and research from many disciplines, from developmental psychology, educational psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. The science of reading has been documented all over the world in all languages and cultures, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars. In short, it demonstrates methods that best help children learn to read, from the earliest moments of spoken language to being able to successfully decode unfamiliar words. And it's based in the 5 ideas core to effective reading instruction: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocab, and comprehension. What it is not is a fad or a pendulum swing or something that a big box publishing company invented to sell curriculum. It's an ever-evolving body of research that we need to base all instruction and teacher education in. This research is even happening today. So it's not something that happened back in 2000 and we haven't touched on it. Like I said, ever-evolving, it's continually being added to. So the science of reading is based on how our brains acquire structured literacy. So I'm going to give a little bit of insight as to how our brains acquire literacy. Reading isn't a natural process. If it was natural, we actually wouldn't have a literacy in our society. Our brains technically have to reorganize to support it. And we have areas of the brain that are designed to support the relationship between auditory processing, phonological processing, and speech. And we have to use those to link it to print. So you're born with a brain that can remember the pronunciation of a word and the meaning, but as you connect the pronunciation and the meaning of a word with its spelling, you actually create a new neural pathway that allows you to remember written words. And once a typically developing reader has done this a few times, the written form of the word gets mapped into their memory. It's always there to retrieve. There's no sounding it out or doing anything conscious to retrieve the word. And this process is called orthographic mapping. You know the word because at some point you connected the pronunciation to the meaning to the print, you repeated it a certain number of times, and it banked it in your long-term memory, and that's it, right? For some people, this is really easy. A little exposure and they can do it. But for a lot of kids, making the connection between speech and print is pretty hard. They need someone to tell them how to do it. They need explicit, detailed instruction, and that means structured literacy. And this is important. How a person is taught impacts different areas of the brain and which ones you pull from. And you want to use the parts of your brain that will be most effective in how you map these words long term. That way, your brain power is being used to understand what you're reading versus sounding it out. And the percentage of kids that research shows that need this type of more impactful, explicit, detailed instruction is about 60%. So I just mentioned this term, but I'm going to bring it up again and go a little bit deeper because this is the ultimate goal, right? As we connect that pronunciation and meaning with the spelling, we're creating that neural pathway. Once we've done it, we never have to do it ever again. We never have to decode that word ever again. And it's there to access unless we have a brain injury, literally. It is why if you are not dyslexic, for example, you can side-eye a word on a paper, put no conscious thought into it and know what it says. It's because it's been orthographically mapped in your brain, right? So if we teach children how to read these words accurately and correctly, literally identifying each word versus like in letter versus in memorization, this is going to happen. When we bypass that step, it is not as likely to happen. So it needs to be more widely understood that reading is rocket science. It's more complex than many in the educational community understand, and brains literally need to reorganize to support reading by connecting that pronunciation, meaning, and spelling of the word. And if we don't instruct this properly, the wrong part of the brain takes over, lending to poor reading and ultimately spelling. So one of the biggest things to take away here is that the science of reading is not a curriculum or a program name that all the schools need to adopt. It's that ever-evolving body of research that still is happening today, and it's what all that instruction needs to be based in, and it's what our teachers need to be trained in. Structured literacy is actually a combination of the elements that are needed for effective reading instruction and teaching methodology that's rooted in the science of reading. And again, it is not a program or a curriculum name, but it is what teachers need to understand. It's each school's responsibility to select curriculum based in the structured literacy and train their teachers on how to use it. So here's some of the key points of structured literacy in a side-by-side comparison with balanced literacy. Remember, of course, it's based in the science of reading. It's rule-based, purposeful scope and sequence with continual reinforcement of skill and concept. And those essential buzzwords: explicit, systematic, and sequential. Students are going to improve their reading by learning and practicing the code of reading. We teach the why. So there's a big misnomer out there that English is extremely haphazard as a language. And really, that isn't true. It is actually 80% rule-based. So we do and can teach these explicit rules for the kids to apply. So structured literacy isn't just repackaged phonics instruction of once upon a time. We're explicitly teaching every component of effective literacy acquisition, and we do this in a systematic and cumulative manner. Of course, things like phonemic awareness and phonics are larger pieces of the earlier grades instruction, but as the rigor of reading increases, we layer on the larger components essential to older students, such as explicit syntax, morphology, and writing instruction. And these aren't as simple as teaching phonics, even though phonics is much more complex than I think a lot of people recognize. You know, when you break down syllabication patterns and that kind of stuff that we do need to equip those younger readers with. But you can see why training an effective curriculum is really, really essential, especially, well, for all grades, but especially as we move into those grades where the rigor of reading increases. So this slide helps to show that we're marrying both structural elements of literacy along with evidence-based teaching methods. So it's not just a new teacher's manual. It is going to take some skill. So this is Scarborough's reading rope, and you've probably seen it before, but it's a very famous illustration of all the fine threads that need to be woven to achieve skilled reading. If you have a reading comprehension problem, you have a reading problem. You can't be good at comprehension without mastering all of the building blocks to get there. We must have a sound basis in all these sub-skills to achieve skilled reading and ultimately comprehension. So we need curriculum that addresses all these fine-tuned areas and folks who understand how to build them. In structured literacy, we break down the building blocks of reading and writing to their component parts so much more. And so that you can see this is so much more than just teaching phonics. So who is structured literacy built for? Well, it's built for everyone. And I really love this graphic because it really clearly breaks down that 2000 National Reading Panel data visually and explains that 60% that I was referring to. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt for just for a second. Our interpreter, who's interpreting in Spanish for us, has requested that we slow down just a little bit, so that she can keep up.
I'm a fast talker, so I'm sorry. Will do.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I can only imagine how hard that was to translate all that. So in kindergarten, we're going to have about 5% of kids who just show up reading. They're those kids that it kind of just seemed to happen by osmosis. And 35% will grasp reading just from broad instruction and exposure. Those are the kids that never hit that low reading group or anything other than tier 1. But the rest of our kids, and that's a whopping 60%, need structured literacy. They need the why behind instruction, either because they're dyslexic or unidentified dyslexic, or their brains just need more layering in explicit instruction. But schools should be a place that service all children regardless of their neurodiversity. At the end of the day, it is the school's responsibility to provide individualized, appropriate, and effective instruction for these kids. So when it's not working, it's really on the school to find the answer and to tailor literacy instruction to fit the needs of that individual child. And of course, I have to touch on dyslexia, because all of this, or the faulty instructional methods, don't just impact our neurotypical readers. It hugely impacts our children with dyslexia. They aren't working from a solid foundation. You know, their house is being built and reinforced often with those extra instructional minutes, those sped minutes, with straw. Because structured literacy approach is half of the equation that we need for dyslexia intervention for kids. And for our borderline babies, especially if we teach them reading initially like this, we can help move the needle enough for them to possibly not suffer the same. So dyslexia therapy is going to be a marrying of structured literacy in a multisensory fashion. But of course, what we're having to do is individualize to the specific dyslexia profile of that child. So if I haven't said it enough, we need to know that our teachers need to have this explicit training in structured literacy for it really to work. But quality curriculum choice is key. There's such a rush to bolt towards structured literacy due to state demands. But my concern is that big box publishers are still up to their same game, and they're currently working to repackage kind of similar garbage. We throw out 3Qing, it's still kind of garbage, and base it in, say it's based in the structure and the science of reading. Administrators are looking to fill the gap really quickly. And so they're choosing some of this. But administrators also don't know much about structured literacy or all the components or how you deliver it. So they don't know how to see through the repackaged garbage. So if schools are trying to make a change and become quickly compliant, my concern is that we're making uneducated decisions that extend this whole mess. Because as I'm sure you know, when a school accepts a new curriculum adoption, it's going to cost them thousands of dollars, and you get stuck with it for a while. And then we use that excuse. That is actually one of the things happening for us right now. So since we've named so many bad curriculums, here are some great structured literacy curriculum adoptions that schools can implement in their gen ed classes and make a huge difference for all of our kids, whether or not they're dyslexic or neurotypical. And it's going to support that 60% of that, of research that shows that they need this explicit instruction. Once you know the name of the curriculum the campus has adopted, you can review it on edreports.org or the Center for Intensive Intervention and learn more about its efficacy. So if you want to assess what your school is using, again, if it doesn't fall into that list, that category, because there's so many curriculums out there, check it out on edreports.org, like I mentioned, or here is the Center for Intensive Intervention, and it's going to show an in-depth review of its efficacy, validity, and it's also a great site for progress monitoring tools. So this is an awesome thing to kind of check your school against. Schools must change. Change is scary and overwhelming. It literally probably feels like they're turning around the Titanic, and I can respect what they're going through. But the old way is not the right way, and we need to stop teaching them the one hand tied behind your back strategy. Schools have to adopt that growth mindset and realize that this is going to be a marathon. It's not a sprint. We need those teachers trained in the principles of structured literacy. All right, so since we have started to make some changes, what ripples are we starting to see in education? Well, all is not lost, because I am starting to see a shift. Some states more than others and some districts more than others. And I hope you guys' district is one of those. But for the nation as a whole, we're really still in the dark ages. Not only does the state force or lead the change, but there's so much more that's when more movement happens, when the administration cares and buys in. Remember that teachers really have no power. They're the low guy on the totem pole, and it has to come from the top. And often schools feel like a good old boy club. I am, like I mentioned, in a rural good old boy district in Texas. And it's like they're ignoring everything that the state is providing related to legislation, because that is just not how they've always done it. So if you take anything away from these slides, it's that when you're representing your kids, you need to first learn how the schools are teaching and providing intervention to these kids. What instructional method are they using? Is it balanced literacy or structured literacy as the base of their instruction? What's the name of the curriculum that they're using? And that this is going to tell us a lot about the chance of their intervention minutes being successful. And another huge question to ask is, how well trained is that teacher or that special education teacher? Now, be wary of anything that's like, they might be certified in OG. Well, I'm here to tell you, for example, that is a blanket. I mean, it just feels there's a huge range of what that can mean. Literally anything from, possibly like an 8-hour training all the way through being, a certified OGA fellow, right? There's a huge range and discrepancy. So it's really important that you ask specific questions, such as, what was involved in that certification, for example. So here's a quick overview of what happens when we do make changes. Mississippi was the first state to implement widespread changes, but they really needed it because they had very, very low proficiency rates. So starting in 2013, they passed a law to implement only evidence-based reading instruction, which by itself is great, but it's just not enough. We have a whole nother layer. And remember, that's that teacher training. So in 2015, the governor's task force followed, where the state implemented changes to early literacy instruction curriculum, in 15 public and private educator training programs across Mississippi. And it was all based in structured literacy. Now, remember, this is just to pre-service teachers. But that simple change, the 4th grade proficiency level, increased 5 full points in only 2 years. Now, some people call this the Mississippi miracle, but it didn't just happen. It was made, obviously. Of course, they had room for growth, but they were marrying proper educator training and evidence-based reading instruction and evidence-based curriculum in the schools. And as of 2019, Mississippi moved from 49th to 29th in the nation. And it was so successful that they ended up actually coining the term in the literacy industry as the Mississippi model. The good news is that many states are trying to replicate what Mississippi has done. If Delaware approves their legislation, it's going to be 70% of them requiring evidence-based reading instruction as their standard in the classroom. And this is all so much harder for teachers, the components of structured literacy, requiring that evidence-based curriculum is a great step, but it won't be as impactful and understand how to deliver it to their students. I'm going to turn my camera off real quick. So as of 2024, 13 states have banned 3Qing, but only 4 of them have banned it in educator training. And here's a visual of that shift nationwide. Happily, Virginia has both science of reading legislation, needing to have that evidence-based curriculum, and a 3Qing ban. Now, this is a big synthesis of everything in my presentation. It's a visual summary of everything that needs to change to fix the system. It starts with awareness, which, believe it or not, we still don't have enough of. Districts need to be willing to adopt growth mindsets and realize that the problem won't get fixed by repeating the same thing. Change is scary, and it's going to require a decision to train our staff in structured literacy and actually probably even bring in some certified experts for their campus and purchase curriculum that supports structured literacy. But what leads all that? Well, it's funding, of course. Oftentimes, it means shifting funding from the technology upgrade to literacy, or writing grants, or having PTOs raise money, because we can't rely on the states only to prioritize it. I've seen all these things happen. Of course, a college level training needs to start to incorporate structured literacy into their coursework requirements, and are going to need to make sure that that is something that is occurring in universities across the nation. And sadly, it just still, we're too far from it. So this is my last slide. And this is, I always say, to beware of the illusion of compliance, because as we pass more and more legislation and districts catch on, be careful that they don't start to check boxes for show that aren't actually effective, because everyone's trying to save money. This is happening in Texas, so I really wanted to bring it up. Naturally, parents trust schools because they're giving the illusion of compliance in a lot of situations. Here's some examples from my professional world, but you're going to get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Like, they have a dyslexia program, but it's watered down and not executed by a true dyslexia professional. They're addressing dyslexia, but no evidence-based dyslexia-specific program is being implemented, and they're simply lumping kids into the resource room with everyone else and giving them more of what didn't work in the classroom. They're providing accommodations, but they're not stringent, and there are no consequences, excuse me, for not executing it in the classroom. They're giving pull-out intervention support minutes, but it's way too few, and it's not aligned with what the research says that they need, just aligned with school schedules. It's really time for everybody to do it right and not give parents the illusion of compliance. It's not just about getting a new curriculum. It's not just laws. Lots of pieces have to come together to make the change. And it's about new policies that help to support the teachers getting trained. Lots of laws get put on the books and never followed. The laws on the books are the easy part. The administration needs to buy in for success and overhaul, and we're not going to be successful unless administration is on board. And I mean anything from the superintendent down to the district literacy director and principals. If this issue means enough to enough people, then the issue isn't going to go away. What I'm concerned about is this is kind of the next shiny thing, right? What about 2 years from now, after the science of reading media has worn out? And I can tell you, and I'm sure that you guys stand behind me, that this actually matters to the core of so many people. And so people are going to have to keep going to bat and keeping that momentum going, and not assuming that we're fixed. So I have to leave you with one of my favorite sayings. It's never let a broken system convince you that you have a broken child. And Frederick Douglass said it best: it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. It was your choice to sit through this that because it's all a step forward into having a voice. Each one of you is such a powerful ally in this community. And what I always tell them, bean soup. So if you have any questions, please always feel comfortable reaching out to me. I'm always just here to advocate and support for kids. And this is how you get in touch. All right, so I guess I'll turn it over to Miss Mary Stowe.
Thank you so much, Megan. And yes, Mary is with us from William and Mary College, and she is going to talk a little bit about how this applies in Virginia with Virginia state specific legislation and initiatives that are going on.
There were a couple of questions from Megan. Did we want Megan, did you want to answer those through the chat?
Well, I can do either. While she's presenting, I can try and just work the chat. How about?
Okay, whatever you would, however you want to handle that. How about you, Amanda?
Whoever y'all want.
Whichever you are all most comfortable with.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Megan, you covered so much. There's nothing left for me to say. So give me just one moment. I think the internet is slow everywhere this evening, so give me 1 second. Megan and I spoke a little bit yesterday, and I did pick or place some of the links that I had shared with her in the chat in regard to structured literacy. And so I did place in the chat an infographic from the International Dyslexia Association that gives a really nice view of structured literacy. But because this is the 75th anniversary year for the International Dyslexia Association, or IDA, they have published a special edition of their journal called Perspectives. And that journal updates all of our understandings around structured literacy since that term was coined by IDA in, I want to say, 2014 or so. So I put both of those links in the chat. So if you want additional information about structured literacy, you can find it there. Because Megan covered so much information so very well, I was only going to provide an update on the Virginia Literacy Act and then some additional resources. It only says ENSL here, or the National Center for Improving Literacy, but I thought it was important to include some from the Virginia Literacy Partnerships, because one of the pieces that have been so very important with the legislation that has passed in Virginia is that we include parents in all of the information that has come forward. I am by no means an expert in the Virginia Literacy Act. I do attend meetings regarding that, and then I am familiar with the resources that are on the site and have attended trainings by the Virginia Literacy Partnership. But there always seems to be something to learn. So hopefully let's delve into it. If you click on through, okay, I'm sorry. I was just reading the chat thinking there might be a question for me. So I'm going to move ahead. And much of the information that Megan shared really plays into why we needed the Virginia Literacy Act. So the first piece is to reverse the trends of literacy levels, and she outlined those so very well for you. We didn't have Virginia specific, but I do have Virginia specific. In Virginia, we've had a number of we've had different numbers forwarded right after the pandemic. 74% of K-2 students were not reading or acquiring reading skills where they should be. And I think the latest, if I'm remembering correctly, was 64%. And then we also need to know that from the NAEP scores for Virginia, that with the 2022 scores, Virginia had a 10-point drop. And so this trend needs to be reversed. And it's not, the downturn didn't begin with the pandemic. I apologize. The pandemic didn't begin with the pandemic. This downward turn began before the pandemic. And so we really need to reverse those trends. The other piece, as they're saying here, is that we do need to address the learning loss that did occur during the pandemic. And so that is accurate. We did experience a downturn then, but that downturn had begun before. And for many of the reasons that Megan spoke about in regard to balanced literacy and whole language usage and the preponderance of its usage. And then what must Virginia do with the Virginia Literacy Act and and its components? We need to provide support to those increasing numbers of at-risk readers, but we also need to provide supports to the teachers with evidence-based instructional strategies and curricula. And I know Megan showed several curricula that are out there that are available, but she also talked a lot about professional development. So we're going to delve into that in just a moment as well. But what we also need to know is that the outcome for the Virginia Literacy Act is that we want to ensure that all children read at benchmark in K-5, and this is just to begin. They will address 6-8 at a later date. The programming that needs to be approved and supports for that are being rolled out slightly later, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. So those are really the underpinnings of the Virginia Literacy Act. Know that the Virginia Literacy Act was first passed in 2022. And then updated. There were some additions and amendments made in 23, and there were some further additions and amendments made in 24. Okay, the ones in 24 were very slight. But we do have a rigorous schedule to maintain for the Virginia Literacy Act, or VLA, as many of us refer to it. And we have, right now, we are on the trajectory for a lot of professional development. So the first piece about VLA is that it does define evidence-based literacy instruction and science-based reading research. So in Megan's presentation, she referred to this as the science of reading. In Virginia, in the VLA, they refer to that as science-based reading research. The rationale behind that using SBRR is that it does align with federal legislation, and that's what they wanted to do with that work. But it has two qualifications. It's evidence-based, and it must be based on science from reading research. Okay. The other piece, or the next pieces that we want to make sure align, are that core curricula will align with the science of reading or science-based reading research. And so and I'll show you the website in just a moment so that you can see the core the tier 1 or core programs that have been approved by VDOE. They were vetted and then approved, and then divisions make their selections for K through 5. Here it says supplemental K-8, but again, that's slightly altered since this slide was produced. The supplemental programs that are now being approved or provided are K-5. The intervention programs that are being provided are K-5 as well. And those are on the VDOE's website. They by the Board of Education, the Virginia Board of Education, and you can find links to those on within the board meeting. They may have migrated over to the Virginia Literacy page now, but when I checked just a day or so ago, that had not occurred. What I'm understanding with the latest update is that supplemental and intervention programs for 6-8, that vetting will begin again in June or July. We'll look at that when we look at the April update. And then it does require additional staffing. So you can see that in the past, schools would have a reading specialist with a different ratio of specialist to student. With the Virginia Literacy Act, or VLA, we have one reading specialist for 550 students in K-5 and one reading specialist for 1,100 students, 6-8. The VLA requires professional development for not only reading specialists, but general educators, special educators, and administrators. The VLA forwards this notion that we're going to partner with families. And so there are a lot of documents that will be available from each division for parents to be able to review. The literacy plan proposed by a division will need to be sent to VDOE by a certain date. I didn't include those dates here because I didn't know that, well, we had a short time and I didn't know if that was something that everyone was looking at. at this very point. They're also approving reading plans for all students who might need a reading plan that will dovetail with any students that have IEP goals as well. And then the other piece about partnering with families is that I have provided some resources or links to resources that the Virginia Literacy Partnership from UVA has provided for families as well. And then finally, the fifth bullet here, or the fifth item to discuss, and this is what Megan indicated, what can be a great challenge. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but Megan mentioned Mississippi. Carrie Wright, who was the superintendent of the Department of Education in Mississippi at the time of the Mississippi model, came to speak in Virginia when the Virginia Literacy Act began to roll out. And so she spoke to the Board of Education and provided an overview of the work that they had done in Mississippi to help Virginia know just what had occurred. So I meant to say that earlier, and please forgive me on that. But one of the pieces that we've talked about that is beginning and will take a bit of work to make sure that it happens is that Virginia teacher preparation programs, educator preparation programs will require that the science of reading or scientifically based reading research will need to be included in their coursework. It is proposed that syllabi will be provided. Will be reviewed and audited. I don't know anything about that timeline at the moment. I've not received any information about that particular timeline, but I do know that that is anticipated. I do know that a number of programs within Virginia have aligned their teacher preparation programs, their reading specialist programs as well, preparation programs as well, to align with SBRR or Science of Reading. There is a micro-credential program for an add-on for reading specialists that has been announced. It has not begun, but there is a way for individuals who are interested to sign up for that or to let folks know their interest. Okay, so I know that that was a lot of information to cover very quickly, and I apologize, but I do want to get to the links here on this particular page. If you'll give me a moment, I'll look at the chat. There were a number of questions. I don't know if they're addressed to me or not.
I will help facilitate those as soon as you are done. So if you
okay, thank you. I didn't know if I needed to answer those now or not. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, so let's go. I'm going to use this link to the VDOE webpage, the Virginia Literacy Act. You can, I will send the PowerPoint slides to anyone, to whomever I'm supposed to send them. So that you can click on these links. But what I have listed here is listed on this particular page. Again, the recommended intervention and recommended supplemental programs were on the Board of Education's meetings for March 27, 28. I don't know if that's migrated over. We will certainly find that out as we go to the Virginia Department of Education website if we go there. We should be going there. Aha, yes. I don't know why today has been a challenging day to be on Zoom, but this is the landing page within the Virginia Department of Education's website, of course, labeled the Virginia Literacy Act. If you'll notice, there are pieces very similar to what I have reviewed with you. Here, if you scroll down, you will see the updates. So there is a new update for April, and it does include some of the information that I just mentioned. But what you'll also notice is that the supplemental access codes and intervention access codes for K-5 have been posted for divisions. There is a new draft of the reading plan template. This reading plan will be developed by reading specialists at the schools. It will be based, the reading plan will be based on assessments that are provided to the students. And so the VALS assessment will be out and ready to replace PALS, and that's VALLS. That is within the VALS with 2 S's system. And so VALS will be the screener that is used, and there are guidelines as to when it will be administered. Excuse me. And then when we progress monitor with students who are receiving that more intense intervention at tier 2 and tier 3, the UVA group has provided a list of progress monitoring tools that are available. One of those is Dibbles. Dibbles is available for no charge on the University of Oregon's website. So that's the draft of the student reading plan. It is still open for public comment if you would like to comment on that. And you can see here where you would, where you can view the reading plan. You'll notice that there's a VLA implementation playbook that's available to you as well. There, the division literacy plan and the instructions and updates are there for March. And then again, the division literacy plan was updated from January to March. But then you'll see a number of other links available here if you're interested in any of that information. And so I'm noticing here, approved core instructional programs, grades K-5. What they've done with that is to look at various programs that applied. They looked at the components of the programming according to a rubric. And if the programming met the rubric, then they were forwarded on. If it did not, it was sent back to the publisher, and the publisher had the option to make updates to that and then to move forward or resubmit. So you can see that that link is there as well. And then there's a curriculum review process update from the Virginia Literacy Act as well, and then some FAQs and things of that nature. And then there is a work group. You can see that there are VLA, there's an advisory work group and the members and the times that they've met, their meeting slides, and then some resources and explainers, webinars and presentations and additional materials. Okay, so I hope you'll explore that. I can put this link in the chat when I finish the presentation if you would like that information. Okay.
I put that link in the chat while you were talking. So.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so very much. There is another link, and this I found specifically on the VDOE's page that led to parents. Let's see if this one links as well. Yes. So this is, you can see on down the left-hand side, I had to actually move myself to see it. That's the craziness of Zoom, is that you have to move everything around, the presenters do, to see what's on the screen. So you can see that there is this link for parents and students. And what I have done is gone to the literacy tab on that navigation bar, and it has taken me to this page. This also includes the VLA implementation playbook that I mentioned earlier. And then there is a presentation about Everyone Reads, about the why for the Virginia Literacy Act, the VDOE standards of learning resources in relationship to reading, and then additional resources here for you as well. Interestingly enough, they do list the National Center on Improving Literacy, and I was going to take you to that website as well. So lots of resources available for parents. They The department and the leadership within our Commonwealth at the moment really encourages partnership with parents and listening to the voice of parents as well. So as we proceed, this is the Virginia Literacy Partnership website that includes lots of information for educators, for families, for communities, and so on. So if you recall, they did indicate that with the science of reading, reading instruction needs to be based on research. And so there is a tab within the Virginia Literacy Partnership that does talk about the research behind the science of reading. There's another tab for lots of educator information. There's another tab for family. So I'm going to click on that and take you to that page. And encourage you all to please look at this as well, because there are a number of resources for families. It's going to take a minute to pull that up. And as I scroll down, you can see that there are a number of resources available to help support children at home. And then if you want to know anything about some of the information related to what your educators are learning, you can also click on that tab. So with professional learning for educators, there is the value series. And so if you're interested in going through that information, that is available to everyone as well. There are modules on each of the areas that we need to think about in relationship to the Virginia Literacy Act, the outcomes for the Virginia Literacy Act, how to support our students, what should instruction look like, what should be included at core, what should be included as we move through the MTSS system, and so on. So SBRR, each of the modules includes a video, an infographic, information, and so on. And you'll see we have SBRR, explicit instruction, data literacy. And then if we scroll down, language development, phonemic awareness, fluency, phonics, comprehension, vocabulary. And so there's lots and lots and lots of resources available to support families and learning. Okay. The other site that I would direct you to would be the National Center for Improving Literacy. This is just one infographic that they have on their website. It's one of my favorites. I just based my, when you write your dissertation, you have to have a conceptual framework, and this is my conceptual framework. To me, it speaks volumes about what we need to think about in regard to reading instruction, and the 4 quadrants just cover so much information. And I know we're a bit pressed for time, and I'm sorry to go on. I'm actually spending more time than I thought. I apologize. But there is a link to this that you can read more about on the National Center for Improving Literacy's website. And then finally, here is a link to the website itself and information that you can find to support your learning around literacy instruction. Lots of infographics to support learning. They're not only in English, but also in Spanish. And so when I provide the PowerPoint, you'll have access to all the links as well. Okay. Go back. I think that's all I was going to share, because I thought there might be some questions that you might have.
Yes, I do have some questions that I've gathered from the chat. Megan, would you
Okay.
be willing to put your video on too, in case you guys can choose who answers what? All right, I'm going to spotlight all of us. Give me just a second. Okay, everyone should now see all 3 of us. And all right. We had a couple of questions about secondary literacy, so I'm just going to kind of put them both together. Megan, I think you might have seen a little bit of it in the chat from before, but we have in FCPS, and I'm sure we're not alone, a literacy crisis with our older students in upper elementary, middle, high school who miss structured literacy, further harmed by the pandemic, obviously. The Virginia Literacy Act, as we talked about, only talks about K through 8 with a focus on K through 3 so far, K through 5 so far, as Mary was discussing.
K through 5.
So do we know in Virginia, is there anything, or nationally, is there anything out there to support older learners who haven't had this, who need to catch up before they graduate?
Would you like me to talk about Virginia, or Megan, would you like to jump in?
I can just speak to general, guys. There is much less when it comes to, I think the primary focus is occurring on those younger, more formidable years, 100%, because it's a lot, I think, in effect, a lot easier somewhat to package a lot of these effects. And so one of the things that I said in the chat was that it really does take the onus onto the teachers a lot more to educate themselves. There are a lot of instructional type books, but obviously when you get to an older grade, it's not like a teacher's manual where we can just kind of read the script and keep going. It has to be also applied so much deeper into the content areas that they're doing and often woven in. So writing, for example, right, there are professional books out there that kind of teach and equip these teachers with how to do it, but it isn't something that's packaged anymore. It kind of puts that onus on teachers. So there are things, I will tell you, at least I can speak in the dyslexia world. We do have packaged curriculum that targets those older kids because, you know, just because they're older and missed that pocket doesn't mean that the issue doesn't still exist. And it does fast forward through a lot of the kind of more basic concepts when we know that they're at the point developmentally to digest a lot of that a lot quicker, and we spend a lot more time on more like structured word inquiry, where we're teaching them to break these bigger words down. We're really focusing on morphology, that type of thing. But you know, that is something in the dyslexia world. I don't know if, you know, in terms of school-based curriculum that schools can purchase, that I don't have as good of an answer on. So Mary, what can you add to that?
A few things. So there are some, you're absolutely right. The difficulties that students are experiencing at older ages are much more intractable. And we really do need to figure out that happy medium between accommodations and still teaching to read. So just because a student has an accommodation, say, with read aloud as an example, it does not negate the need to teach that child to read. And I say child, I know most middle schools and high school kids are going to go, no. But anyway, so that one of the things that in my profession that I do teach teachers to use are what are called the strategic instruction model learning strategies, which come from the University of Kansas. They are very explicit instructional strategies to teach students content, but Megan just mentioned structured word inquiry. And one of the things that we do think about and discuss is there is a morphology explicit strategy. It's not a program. These are strategies to teach content, that there is a very explicit way to teach morphology that you could then follow up with structured word inquiry that has a structure of its own as well. I do know that there will be programming that will be vetted in Virginia according to for 6 through 8. If you saw on the screen for the Virginia Literacy Act where it talked about all the updates, there was an update for April. If you go to that or click on that link, I believe it says mid-July, they will begin accepting applications again for the 6 through 8. I believe the timeline is mentioned within a paragraph within that very lengthy update. I want to say the update is probably about 9 pages long. So there's a lot of information in that update. And I believe it addressed this very piece. So supplemental and intervention programs will be discussed on one of the pages. The other thing that's discussed is the micro-credentialing piece that I mentioned earlier. That's on, I know, on page 6 because I looked it up today. So I would go to that update to find out a little bit more about what's happening in 6 to 8 world.
Right. Thank you both. You may be aware or not, Fairfax County started moving towards science of reading-based literacy instruction before the adoption of the Virginia Literacy Act. And one of the issues that we have continually raised with the school district in our advocacy as SEPTA has been the accessibility of and the availability of science of reading-based curriculum for our students who are accessing adapted curriculum, who are accessing what we call our Cat B classrooms or self-contained classrooms. Can either of you speak to that at all?
That's a tricky one. That is a very tricky one. There is more and more research coming out in regard to that area. There has been a shift in our understanding of what instruction might look like in some of those in the areas of students who are more severely impacted or more profoundly impacted in their ability to acquire literacy skills. But what we're finding is that when we talk about explicit instruction, what we know for most disabilities or disability areas is that some sort of explicit instruction is going to need to happen. Mm-hmm. What that looks like will depend upon the child, of course. And we are beginning to discover, or what we know, let's just say what we know is that the pathway to reading for all students is the same. What is going to vary are dosage and intensity and all of those. When you looked at the ENSEL intensification framework, all of those other areas like cognitive processing, instructional design, and the the instructional delivery, all of those areas are going to be impacted, and we need to think a little bit more in that realm. But research is beginning to appear that is aligning with the science of reading around supporting students with more significant disabilities.
And everything that Mary is saying is completely correct. But that is where that individualization piece really comes in. And the amount of repetition and exposures, like she's saying, changes. And the length of time for progress is going to increase, but it happens. And I can say this personally, we have multiple kids in this situation who work with us, and we have still seen great gains, what we consider to be great gains, who in the public education system, maybe 17 and didn't know their letters. And now they're reading. So it really just takes that patient and adaptation to exposure to get there. But what she's saying is correct. That research is supporting that everyone reads the same way, learns to read, the same way.
Thank you both. I may have a personal question that I follow up and send to you both on this. I do want to take a look at our time. We do have a few more questions, but it is also 8:56. So I want to ask the both of you, would you be okay with staying for a few extra minutes to answer a few more questions?
I have a couple minutes. I am the mother of 4 children running loose downstairs.
Understood.
From a big softball game. So I can give you about 5 more minutes if that's okay.
Okay. All right, perfect. And I think that'll about 5 more minutes, I think will work for our interpreter as well. And I may email you some of these also to follow up if that's okay. On the educator preparation, which educator preparation programs are required to ensure candidates have coursework that include the science of reading? And do you know, I think this is Virginia specific, do you know if it includes special education teachers in addition to general education teachers? And if there's any requirements, as we were just discussing, for the unique needs of students with disabilities?
I know less about that piece because there's been less spoken about in regard to that, and the vetting process, I'm not aware of where we are with any of that at the moment. There is so much professional development coming down the line for teachers that are in-service teachers. And so the pre-service piece, I've not heard as much discussion around. I know there's discussion around it, but the focus at the moment appears to be with having divisions create their literacy plans, having the reading plan approved. So the department is going through their steps, the board is going through their steps, the Virginia Literacy Partnership is going through its steps to make sure that VALS is research-based, and they're assimilating the information that they had from the pilot and the soft rollout. And then the programming, that piece, divisions are still determining the programming that they'll use for core, and still looking at supplemental and intervention as well. So there's lots of professional development that's going to go on. If you look at that update for April that I spoke of a moment ago, there is a schedule for training, and it includes general educators, special educators, administrators, and so on. So there's a fairly rigorous schedule that's going to happen for learning. There also, currently, there are modules that have been developed by the Virginia Literacy Partnership to help begin that learning piece. So there's going to be, a number of learning components for teachers who are in service at the moment. So not only will those who administer VALS need to learn how to do that, there also will be professional development provided around the core programs that will be adopted, around the supplemental and intervention programs that will be adopted, but then also all about explicit instructional techniques. So just in very general, and those will happen through the Canvas modules that are available from the Virginia Literacy Partnership. So that's really been the focus. I do know that there is the piece of VLA that refers to teacher prep programs for general educators. We'll also, I'm sure, look at special educators. That's been a more nebulous piece of VLA. And I think we're just beginning to have some understandings develop around how reading specialists and special educators will interface in regard to reading plans and IEP goals and things of that nature. And then, of course, the vetting of syllabi. So I know there have been some discussions about how that might happen. I've not heard that any decisions have been made, but I know there's some that are fine with the NCTQ reviews, some that are not so fine with that type of review, since that can be done, through a computerized version. So I've heard lots of discussion. I just, I don't know that anything specific has come down at the moment. It's not on the website. I've not heard anything specific there either. And I'm sorry, I don't have much information about that.
That's okay. No, understood. We know that this has been a nebulous area. We have been asking for information on this with VDOE as well, going back a long time. We are a small voice in a very big pond.
Well, there are actually two laws that apply to it, and I think the other law is still in effect. I'll have to go back and check, but there was actually a law passed that was not part of VLA that asked for review of teacher preparation programs prior to VLA, and that was to come into effect about this time as well.
Okay. We will take a look into that also.
So there's a focus.
Thank you both for joining us tonight. It is 9:01, so I do want to wrap up. You have been incredible presenters. This is a lot of information, and we really appreciate the time that you spent with us tonight. For everybody listening, if you are still here and you are obviously interested in literacy, so please contact our advocacy chairs, advocacy@fairfaxcountysepta.org. We are doing a lot of work in this area, and Diane Cooper-Gold, who's been asking questions, is our representative on FCPS's Equitable Access to Literacy Plan that has been overseeing the implementation of this move to the science of reading-based instruction. So please ask us questions. We will send further questions on to Mary and Megan via email, and we'll find a way to share them with the membership after this. Thank you all again, and thank you to Adriana for your interpretation this evening.
And I did put a link to my presentation in the chat, and I also sent it to you just to distribute. So
thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.